Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to today's webinar on cooperatives. This is our part 3 of the session. As you know, during the webinar, your mic and video are turned off. If you've got any questions, please put them in the Q&A or put them in the chat. Of any conversations you want to have with us, please put them in the chat. If you move on to the next slide, we are the West Business Development Centre, a non-profit funded by the Small Business Administration and a couple of other folks. We are both the Women's Business Centre and the Small Business Development Centre for Mendocino and Lake Counties. Move on to the next slide. It shows that we provide one-on-one counselling, webinars, loan packages and advising to small business owners and entrepreneurs at every stage of business development. We have a pool of experts covering almost every area from permitting to HR and e-commerce, and also, as we have with Ashley, specific areas, speciality areas. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a West Centre client, please visit our website or give our office a call, and I shall pop that in the email in the chat for just a second. If you move on, that's our disclaimer, which you've seen before, and it basically says this is for information only, and you should get your help, get professional help when you need it. I'm going to hand it over to the person you all came to see, the expert on the space of worker-owned businesses. So, Ashley, take it away, please.
Great, thanks, Alan, and welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back, those of you who've been here before. As Alan said, we're on part 3, talking about cooperatives. And a little quick background about me. I started really studying cooperatives in Los Angeles as part of a master's program. After being a small business owner myself, I went back to school and really got excited about the power of worker-owned cooperatives. Ended up starting the LA Co-op Lab with several other people there, which is still operating strong and helping co-ops in the LA area. And moved from there to work with the Arizmendi Association of Cooperatives in the Bay Area, and started as a worker owner at one of the bakeries in the Bay Area, and was there and got to learn what it really felt like to be in a real worker co-op, what it felt like to get hired and go through the training and actually become an owner, and then co-manage the business for some time. And after that, I moved into one of the other Arizmendi co-ops, which is called the Development and Support Cooperative, which is the team of business providers that helps the back end of all the network of 9 businesses in the Arizmendi Association. And more recently, I also now do some work in Colorado for the Rocky Mountain Employee Ownership Center, along with Arizmendi, and help businesses pursuing any type of employee ownership, from ESOPs to employee-owned trusts or profit sharing and or cooperatives. Help any business owner that wants to transition to some form of employee ownership. And today we're going to talk about a lot of the pieces of the foundation that allows for healthy cooperative organization and management and governance. So today, because this is part 3, I'm not going to dive into much background about what worker cooperatives are. We are talking today just about worker co-ops. You might remember from the first session, there's lots of different types of co-ops that function differently, different types of consumer co-ops, housing co-ops, et cetera. But today we're talking specifically about businesses that are owned by the workers in that business. And we're going to dive into a lot of details, and this slideshow will be shared with you afterwards. So you'll always have it to come back to for reference. But we're just going to move through a lot of details about things you can use for meetings that you might want to just refer back to if and when you start a cooperative. Hopefully it would help you in terms of remembering what needs should be addressed at meetings, how to organize those meetings. We'll talk a little bit about different types of decision-making that cooperatives use that you could look to. What are vision and mission statements? Also, a big key piece of the foundation often is having a shared either vision and or mission, and actually documenting that can be helpful in some cases. And then also just going really quickly over some types of policies that you might want to start with when you're forming a cooperative. And then at the end, I have some resources that you can use if you are in the process of starting up a co-op, things you can look back to on the web. for reference. As Alan mentioned, please feel free to put questions in Q&A or the chat anytime, and he can interrupt me as I'm going. Happy to take questions along the way, or I'll be sure to leave some time at the end as well. So we're going to start with group communication in worker co-ops. As you can imagine, in businesses where multiple people are at the core of making that business run, communicating well is one of the very key aspects to focus on and to do well. And of course, one of the main places we do that together in co-ops or any setting really is meetings. So we're going to just talk through some strategies for you to think through about meetings and how to structure them and what roles you might want to have. And these might be things that you have in other organizations too. A lot of it is just general good meeting practice. But the difference is that for co-ops, these are happening very regularly where everyone, depending on your size, it can be all the owners, all the member owners. A quick note here, if you haven't been in the previous webinars, I'll probably switch between the term member or owner, and those are used interchangeably in co-ops. It means the same thing. You'll see that a lot if you start doing research. So in most co-ops, obviously, to keep things running, the members or owners are holding regular meetings. When those can really be held according to whatever industry, what makes sense for your business. But these would be times when you're sharing updates, ideas, concerns, and oftentimes because the whole group of member owners or say it might be a subcommittee or a subsection of those members, it would be the board of directors. We'll also talk a little bit about committee meetings, right? There might be all different layers and combinations of people meeting. And oftentimes people will be developing and presenting proposals that they will bring for decisions or discussion. And those in a co-op are really all the ideas and things that are going to move the company forward. And in the previous webinar, we talked about different types of decisions that would be made at different types of meetings and in different groups, right? So the board of directors, if they were meeting, they might be discussing governance items that would be different than, say, a management team who's meeting to talk about operations or how to manifest the goals set forth by that board of directors. But in any case, the meetings often share all of these ideas and goals, because whatever team is coming together for the co-op, everybody is participating in either the governance or the management aspects that make this business run. And the size of the co-op is one piece that often dictates the frequency of how often you want to meet. Sometimes people meet every week, especially I've seen a lot of co-ops when they're first forming. They might want to meet every week to have a meeting with the core people that are getting together. When I was a member of the Arizmendi Bakery in the Bay Area, we would meet once a month as a whole bakery. All the owners would come together once a month. And then as part of that meeting, we would also have our candidates or our employees, the people that were on track to become members. So anybody who was new would also come to those monthly meetings, and they would come to just a portion of it where we'd have agenda items that were not confidential board items. So we would always make sure we'd split up the agenda. And that way, the people that were coming on board would get a feel of what the meetings are like. They'd get to listen to a lot of the conversation. They'd get to know everyone that they would be a co-owner with before having to make that decision. And it's always really different than being on shift with someone doing the actual work, getting together to feel what it's like to be the co-owners of a business. That can be a really good learning time too for people coming on board. You can meet twice a year if you're smaller and feel like you set big things in motion with committees. So just a note, you can really set that however you want, and then that would be detailed in your bylaws. You just want to adhere to whatever agreements you've made in your bylaws about when you're going to hold, say, an annual meeting, how often you're going to hold board meetings, etc. So the bylaws is what dictates the high level of those meetings, and then you can internally set up the the schedule for the meetings that you want to have in-house. So smaller subgroups might also have separate meetings, right? So the board, the whole group of owners might be meeting on a certain schedule, but then you might have committees, which we talked about last week, that are empowered committees that are still making decisions, but they might meet on a, say, bi-weekly schedule. If the board's meeting monthly, something like that, it might be more often. And different departments, if you have a more traditional management system, different teams can be meeting, and then everyone can come together at those larger meetings and be appraised of the work that these smaller groups are talking about, and the decisions that they're making in between the larger meetings. And meetings within co-ops can be pretty formal or informal. The beauty of the co-op is that it can really be designed to fit your group. You can feel that out and decide on how many of these things I'm going to talk about today you either want to implement or not. And the only thing I'd like to point out here, which I know I've mentioned, I think, a few times throughout the webinars, is that it's just really important in a co-op that you know which hat you're wearing. If the beginning of a meeting is a board meeting and later it switches into a marketing committee meeting, you have to be ready. You might be on both of those boards. You might be on the board of directors and you might be on the committee, and you're the same person doing 2 or 3 or 4 things. And so just making sure that people know when a certain portion changes and when another piece opens up, so that you're in the right brain space, because that's often different in co-ops where you're performing multiple roles, and literally within one meeting, you might be switching hats. One thing I wanted to bring forth again today, I'm going to really just throw out a lot of concepts and things that you could use. They're not essential, but they're different strategies that I've seen within co-ops that have worked well. And one of those things is kind of breaking down at the beginning before you start holding these meetings together, or if you're joining into a group already using different meeting styles. This is something to keep in mind, that one way to look at it is that there are always 3 different types of needs that people have when they come together in a group. And in order to effectively make a decision or participate in an active way, feel comfortable, there's these 3 different buckets, kind of, that if they're all taken into account, can create a good space for people to be able to operate collectively. So I'll go through these really quickly, just some of the details around that. So one thing you'd want to look at is procedural needs. Was there an acceptance of things like ground rules, which we're going to talk about, an agenda? Did people see that beforehand? Are people coming at this with a shared idea of what the reason of the meeting is? Does everybody know what the decision-making process is going to be? Have you decided that ahead of time so that someone doesn't think that you're going to have a vote when somebody else thinks you might just be talking about it today, or trying to reach consensus, which is another thing we'll talk about. And then do these needs, the procedures, do they support the next 2 that we're going to talk about? So substantive needs is, is everybody sharing the important information, like the substance of the meeting today? Do we feel like everybody has the information that they need to make these necessary decisions? And in a co-op, that can often be challenging because all of you might have different roles doing different things. So it's important to just be thinking through, as these meetings are also happening on top of the other work that you do. Has the committee, say, if they're bringing a proposal, have they gotten the information to the whole group? Was it in a timely way that we feel like everybody can come together with a shared equal ability to make these decisions because of the way information was shared? So really just making sure the substance of what you're going to talk about has been shared in an effective way. And then there's interpersonal needs, which is not unique to co-ops, right? When we come to a space, it's just really important that there are certain aspects that allow for people to feel comfortable. Do member owners feel like they can focus? Are there access to things like bathrooms and water? And especially on a more conceptual level, is it a respectful and supportive environment for all the different types of people that might be coming together, different power dynamics that might be there? What can you do to make sure that that is a healthy and supportive environment for everyone to come together? Because you can start to think about these things at the core. You're going to be tackling big decisions together that are about the business, but without these things at the core, you can often reach impasses, but maybe they're due to things like this rather than the actual substance and the topic at hand of the business. So one of the things I mentioned are meeting ground rules. And these are things that people come together around to use as shared agreements, basically, things that people will commit to. And just one, for example, is to be open to new perspectives. That might be something that there's a ground rule laid down by a certain group, and you say, this is something that's really important to us. Another one might be, we will treat each other with respect. And again, these can come really from your group and should be brainstormed from your specific group to make sure that everybody gets on the list what they want and agrees to what is there. And oftentimes in co-ops, people will put these on in non-pandemic times when we can be together, a big piece of paper on the wall so that they're there to check in on. If you're doing it digitally, maybe just something even literally physically on a wall if you feel like you need that, or in the chat box. We often will put those there. Just a way to check in with each other to stay on the same page. So another one would be step forward, step back, if you've heard of that. That's a reminder to people that sometimes there are people that talk more and have an easier time to step forward, give their opinions, but there's other people that don't have such an easy time. So if you are one of those people, you're agreeing to step forward and to give your opinion, but to also step back sometimes and remember that without that space, other people's voices might not be heard as you're tackling proposals and discussions. Another one that seems like it'd be fairly obvious, but can sometimes be very challenging when things get heated and you're making really hard decisions, is just to wait until you're called upon to speak, to not, jump in. And another piece of that I've seen happen a lot, which is also hard when you're with a group of people that you're familiar with, as a thing called crosstalk. You might have heard it called that. Basically, that idea that suddenly one person has just one small comment for what's going on. They say that to someone they're close to, and you start to sense and hear other crosstalk going on, people talking on top of whoever actually has the floor and is talking. And it can be really hard to do that when you are doing the step back. You know you're not going to potentially talk for a little while, to not share your perspective, but some groups decide that they really want to hold that back. So again, there's tons of these, as you can imagine. You can design them yourselves. You can look for examples. And I was just curious, just to take a quick break here to see if anyone's used these, if you're willing to share. If you have an example also to add to my list of one that you liked that you could share with the other people here today, it'd be great to hear just if you've had any experience with this.
I'll give folks a moment or two to get something into the chat, give them a chance. Actually, while we're waiting for that, it seems to me that the on the prior slide where we're talking about the different types of need, that all the first and the second one seem universal within organizations. Mm-hmm. It's the substantive need that kind of feels more connected to the process and style of a cooperative.
Absolutely. Yep, exactly. Because you can think in lots of companies, you're coming to a meeting as an employee and you don't need to know really what's going on, because the two, either directors or CEO or the board, they're making the decisions, and they just come in and they tell you what's going on and you listen. And so it can be a really big shift for people who have not been in a co-op before to understand, and just a real challenge, because you're trying to tackle your job day to day. There's all the stuff you need to know for that. But it is really important that there's enough time and information around so that everybody gets the substance and wraps their head around at least the concept in enough detail that they can contribute effectively. That is some of the benefit about the committees, which we've talked about. Not everybody has to understand everything deeply. So that's the point of having 2 or 3 people, say, in a small co-op go have lots of discussion, do the research, and come back to the team to present kind of the overview. But it means coming to that meeting with enough information that you at least have the overview, because you will be involved in making that decision. And it could have financial impacts, right? If it's coming back to the board level, you're making decisions that could affect how you're going to spend the money of the co-op, how you're going to do different types of operational moves, anything. Yeah.
All those things that could affect the success of the organization. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, you really hit that.
So we've had one, so Anna has thrown into the chat a couple of things. So she said, I use these for my non-profit group. It's a small group, so it's important to remind each other the roles, or many roles, that we all have in the group. So step forward, step back is hard for me. Some individuals need to be given opportunities during the meeting, and also in other instances to find their voice. Pardon me. Sometimes it is shyness. Other times it's just timely opportunities.
Yeah, both good points. I think for nonprofits and other groups, you might see a lot of the same types of meeting structures and roles, and the step forward, step back. And also I was kind of mentioning the crosstalk. It's really hard within co-ops, especially when you are connected, as we were just talking about, to a lot of the issues. It can be really hard to find the balance of that, because you probably do have that. Some people it's hard to step back, some people it's hard to step up, and you're trying to find that middle ground. Yeah. So I think really calling it out, that's a really good point of the ground rules, and even reviewing them sometimes, even quarterly, can help people remember that. If you are the quiet one, you look at it from that perspective, like, okay, I do need to step up sometimes, and otherwise people who might be talking too much get reminded. So it can be really helpful to put them up physically in people's eyesight, even, so that it's there within the space.
So Linda has shared, I always use ground rules in meetings and organizations, but I would think it should be a ground rule for a cooperative that everyone needs to participate. You really can't sit back, she says. And Arno is,
really good point. And that's why I think I like it in this way, where it is step forward and step back. It can't be just sit back, because that's as frustrating as somebody stepping up too much in a co-op. Exactly, to that point. You can't sit there and just let things go, because you've committed to your co-owners that you're going to contribute. And if you're all sharing in the profit and all of that, it is really important that everybody contributes. And so that's that fine line of everybody trying to come in with different personalities to find that balance of it.
Yeah, and it could be a for the extroverts, it's the sit down and shut up requirement. They need to pull in, and for the introverts, it's the step up one. Yeah.
Yep.
Perhaps in a co-op, smaller groups will promote step forward, step back, says Anna.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yep, for sure. And if it's smaller, that can be definitely easier. People get more familiar with each other. There's more space and understanding of each other. When it gets bigger, it's also hard. I can't remember if I have this in the next slides, but I'll just mention it really quick here. A concept called stack. I don't know if anyone has used this in meetings. It's pretty universal in co-ops, and it's a process where if somebody is facilitating that meeting, they take stack, which means that you can raise your hand, just note to the person facilitating that you'd like to talk next, but you're literally just put on a list, so that everybody who wants to talk gets put into that stack to talk. But it allows you then to listen a little bit better, because you're not always waiting to be like, oh, do I have to jump in next? Or what if I forget and somebody else talks? So you just make a quick note either with your hands, just make sure you make eye contact or you actually say stack. And that facilitator's holding that. So then everyone can get in line to talk. So then you can kind of sit back, you're the third person to talk. You don't have to worry that you're going to get lost in the shuffle. So that's a really good strategy, I think, for larger groups. Often it's not necessary for smaller ones. You can find that space, but something to look at if you have a slightly larger group. We've even used it for meetings around 5 of us. If you have that size, I've found it can be useful. So that facilitator is taking that stack and then they call on people. So one person's done. They say, okay, I know you want to talk, but Tim already got on stack here. Or Linda's second after Tim. So you keep this running tally of who wants to talk.
I'd just like to remind folks, when you're sharing in the chat, if you use the all panelists and attendees, everyone can see it. So it's a better conversational tool for all of us. But I'm reading. So Susan was saying she agrees with Linda. Anna was saying active listening. Stack sounds great. The facilitator or another person can take notes for people that want to talk. Yeah, a list. And Linda thinks it's a great idea to put people into the queue.
Yeah, it can really be helpful. It's a little bit hard for the facilitator because you're both listening and you're watching to make sure you're keeping that stack and crossing people off. But it really, I think, does pay off. Okay, so let's dive back into a little more content here. Meeting roles. Again, you can adopt these or not, depending on the size and the way you choose to function. But a really good role I was just talking about is often called the facilitator or the chair of the meeting. There are really good trainings out there for facilitating. It's not easy or often intuitive, and really important that one or more people within a co-op, I think, get some of that training, either by reading about it or learning things like this, how to take stack. And it's important, even in a small group, if it's possible, that you rotate that role, because you can imagine you're part of the co-op, you're trying to engage not only with the decisions in an active way, but often if you're small, this facilitator has to be a member of the co-op also. In larger co-ops, they'll almost always bring in an outside facilitator, someone who doesn't have to make decisions. That's literally just orchestrating the meeting. But oftentimes that's not a luxury that small co-ops have. So if there's one or two of you who feel like you want to do this role, it's not usually something that everybody loves, and that seems okay, but you definitely want to have a few people who enjoy that type of role to get a little training, read about it, and then see if you can rotate so that it's not always one person who has to be facilitating, keeping stack, watching the agenda, and participating in the decisions as well. And then oftentimes, again, this depends on size, but it's nice to have somebody else who takes minutes that's not the facilitator. So again, sometimes multiple people do this, but ideally, if you can have someone taking minutes, somebody else who's facilitating. Here, I did mention that with the stack keeper, you can either have that be the facilitator, or again, if you have the luxury of size, having somebody taking stack who's even separate from the facilitator is really nice, because then all that person is doing is watching to say, okay, this person wants to talk, this person, here's the stack, and they're putting that in a list so that the facilitator can see it. And then that facilitator is going off that list. And that's a really efficient way to go. Again, timekeeper can be separate. It can also be the facilitator, often in smaller groups. That can be really important for co-ops where you're trying to be respectful of people's time while you're tackling lots of big decisions. So someone who's keeping tabs on what you agreed on with the agenda. And I would definitely recommend that. I think people go back and forth, if it's at all possible, to put time frames on your agenda at the beginning to say, we expect this item will take 20 minutes. We're going to try to commit to that, and building out the meeting time to fit what people have agreed to. That can often really help. And if you get to the end of time, what's usually happening then is a facilitator is saying, you know what, we have 2 minutes left in this. do we want to take time from something else, or do we want to close this for today and continue it? So it's just a way, again, to be very upfront with everybody so that you can decide together, yes, we want to bump something else, and we accept that as a group before we start to get squished into the end of this time and things get stressful. Or do we want to just say, this is as far as we made it today. We're going to reschedule this on our next meeting and put X number of minutes for next week. So people might volunteer for the roles. You might want to set a schedule. That's what we currently do as part of my role in Arizmendi, where there's about 5 of us. We just have a little spreadsheet, and we each take on the different roles. We actually have one called a vibes watcher too, which is another one you could consider, someone to just kind of be that person to say, you know what, I feel like let's hold up, let's stop for a minute and check in here. I feel like there's a little bit of stress around this topic. Let's make sure we can stay on track here. So there's all different kinds of roles that might fit your organization, and we just rotate. So all of us do all of them, and we just move one person down for the following week. As I mentioned, totally not necessary to. I work with some co-ops now that are 3 people, and they just have a facilitator and someone who takes notes, and that facilitator does everything else. They don't use Stack. The facilitator keeps time. So you can see how you can really adapt these to the level that you need for your group.
You almost think that it seems like it's crying out for an app for like stack management and timekeeping and
that's a great idea.
Yeah,
I'd never even thought of that, but yeah, where the agenda's there and something's keeping tabs and popping up when you have 3 minutes left or something.
Yeah, and you press a button. Everyone press a button on their phone to get on the stack. Yeah,
to get on the stack. Yeah, a good co-op potential. So now backing up a little bit to prepare for meetings, we were talking about when you're actually in the meeting, but to prepare for them, agenda preparation goes all the way back to what we were talking about in terms of those roles, getting people up to speed. So every member owner should be able to add items to the agenda, which again, can be really different than a traditional company. At the bakery, we had literally a clipboard, very low tech, that was in the office. That was just the agenda for the next month. And when you had an idea, you just jot down with a pen, and whoever was the facilitator would take those, I think it was 10 days ahead was our meeting notice timeframe, and would compile everything that the owners had put on there. So it should not only be accessible for people to add to the agenda ahead of time, but the whole agenda should be accessible to everybody beforehand. And then in addition to that, it's often good to have an agenda review still, just right at the beginning of the meeting. We always had that at the top of our agenda, was the review, to say, here's what got on here. Does it still look good to everybody today? Is there anything that got missed? Or is there anything that somebody no longer wants to talk about today that they want to push, that change? Say, like last night, something shifted and it's no longer relevant. So that can save you some time. And here's just a really quick sample agenda to show you some of these things that we're talking about. Also check-ins. That's something sometimes people are familiar with from other meetings, but oftentimes that's kind of new. But it's a really great co-op strategy because, again, you're all coming together. Oftentimes it's just like a quick personal check-in. How are you doing today? To just be able to say, you know what, I have been super overwhelmed all day. I'm exhausted, just so that people know. Or I had a great day. I'm super energized. I've got a lot on my mind. So then you just kind of get a sense of the room. Really just one sentence. You don't want to take a lot of time on it, but it's just a way that you start to think, if somebody else, I've sensed this stress or frustration coming, you remember back to their check-in, like, oh, they had a really challenging day, or vice versa. So it can be a nice little piece to add in. You could do announcements or check-ins of like vacation time or things like that. Oftentimes reviewing the last meeting's notes, that can sometimes be necessary depending on your structure, if that's something in the bylaws where you have to actually approve meeting minutes. Then you might want to do something like have report backs for committees. If you have groups that are working in between the board meetings, it's nice to give some space for each committee to come together and say, this is what we're working on. We're getting close to this. We'll report back next time. We think we'll have something to actually vote on in, say, 3 months, something like that. And then often you'll be getting into agenda items and actually coming together with a proposal. You have a discussion about it. That proposal comes either to a vote or to a consensus check if you're using consensus, which we'll talk a little bit about. And you're making those decisions. Sort of the heart of the meeting is actually moving things forward. And then oftentimes co-ops will do check-outs as well, kind of a quick, like, what went well today, maybe a meeting evaluation, same kind of like the check-in. You're just saying, you know what, maybe we could do this differently next time, or I thought this went well, this didn't. So lots of ways to do this, but just one sample agenda that includes some of these pieces. Now let's switch gears a little bit to dive into actual decision making. And again, there's lots of different strategies out there. I'm just picking 2 that are the most common that I've seen in cooperatives. And the first one is a majority vote, which you've probably often used in all kinds of organizations. Nothing really different than outside a co-op. If you think back to that agenda, typically what's happening is a proposal comes forward. Somebody's put it on there, a committee or a person saying, I think we have enough information that's been shared. And today we're actually going to call for a vote to see whether we want to approve and move forward with this or not. And often the facilitator can call that, call the vote, or anybody can do that depending on how your meeting's structured, any member or owner. Sometimes that can be just a simple majority. Sometimes it can be a higher majority, like a 67 or 3/4, and that would be defined in your bylaws. So that's something you want to talk about at the beginning. And this goes back to that idea of having shared assumptions that we know, that we've pre-agreed that this is going to be the percentage of vote that passes any proposal. You can have different rules that apply to different decisions, kind of like things we see in other voting aspects, like some are super majorities where you need a certain amount. Other decisions can have different thresholds. So that's just something you want to decide upon as a group ahead of time. And if that's what you're going to do, you know that at the end of every proposal that comes forward, this is what's going to happen. You're going to come together and you're going to vote. A totally different way of going at it and trying to make decisions together is called consensus, which again, you may have heard of in either organizations or different groups that you come together to decide things with. And basically with consensus, rather than a traditional vote, all members must agree or basically reach consensus. And with this, you can imagine the same proposal comes forward. And then the group is talking about it. And the idea is to talk about all the concerns, to basically get to a point at which you say, everybody is willing to move forward with this. It doesn't mean that everybody has to wholeheartedly agree. It often just means that somebody is willing enough to go forward with it, to not block it, essentially. So there can be 3 types of kind of opinions and consensus. One, often you'll see too, if you start reading about it, there's lots written about consensus if you're interested to. I recommend reading kind of the theory, but oftentimes it can be shown by a literal thumbs up. So everybody gets to a point where they say, let's test for consensus. And you see if you're up for it, you say thumbs up. If you have what's called a stand aside, you put your thumb to the side. And that's what I was talking about a minute ago. That's like, I don't know that I'm totally for this, but it's not that big a deal to me to actually halt this. Like, I'm okay with it going forward. Don't love it, but I'm going to stand aside and I'm not going to block it. And a thumbs down literally means I'm not okay with this going forward. And then the proposal opens back up in consensus. People try to talk about what the problem is, and then you test for consensus again. essentially going back and forth until you get everybody to either stand aside or vote for it. And so there are no actual blocks. So as you can imagine, it definitely takes more time than a vote. But the beauty of it is that by the time you do end up with that, you have more buy-in, essentially. And that when the decision is made, all of those issues have been worked out and people move forward. Another thing to mention really quickly is that groups often use modified consensus, which is where you can actually write into your bylaws, we're going to use consensus, but at a certain point, a member or facilitator can say, I think we want to go and look at a vote at this point. We've talked about this for 3 months, and we keep getting to this point. Let's call a vote. And you'll have, if you use modified consensus, you'd have it fully spelled out in your bylaws or your operating agreement about when you would go to that, when you can use it. But that can be a really good combination of both that I've seen work very efficiently. So you try for consensus. If not, you finally say, okay, we're going to switch to this other side. We're going to vote. This is either going to go up or down, and then we're moving forward. And just really quickly to show you, I mostly talked through this, but sometimes I think visually it's nice to see this. This would be a proposal that's either coming out of a meeting or brought to a meeting by a committee. You'd see a discussion at the top. A proposal gets put forth. People might ask questions. You're gauging reactions. If there's some concerns, you can go down that path. And then somebody might restate the proposal at that point, and then you'd be back up at the top, kind of going back through. If the gauge reactions, there's no concerns, that's where you'd either go to call for consensus or call for a vote, depending on what direction you've decided upon. The proposal might be approved, and then you decide where it's going to go from there, what has to happen. The proposal is not approved, then you figure out an alternative plan. Do we want to look at this in a different way, et cetera? But then you can kind of see something going through. It either goes back up, it gets reproposed, or it's going to go out one of these decision-making routes and hopefully get decided on quickly and efficiently, and everybody moves forward. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to different topic. Another piece of the foundation, though, vision and mission statements. You've probably heard about these for sure in the nonprofit sector, mission statements, possibly vision statements. They're also not necessary at all. Sometimes when you're starting a co-op, they can feel like a lot to do, but if you have the time and brain space to do it, it can really help with a co-op. Again, just looking at any kind of shared agreements and work that you can do together. So a vision statement is kind of the bigger statement. It's going to articulate your company's long-term goals. And this can be in different formats. It can be kind of short, a few sentences, or it can be a longer model. And I'm going to show you one business model that's a really good one for visioning in a minute, called Zingerman's. And this really just serves as a source of inspiration, something for you to all come around if you're starting up a business together, or you can do this later if you've been operating for some time and you just want to reset and say, what do we want to commit to for the long term? You can write a vision for X number of years out ahead of you. We did this at the Arizmendi Association. It was just about 20 years in to the whole organization. And we decided, let's try to come together and just have a vision for the next about 5 years. What does that look like? What do we want to get behind? So you can really use it at any point. And a mission statement is more so how an organization is going to work towards achieving that vision. So it's more like the working strategy in a way of like, this is how we're going to achieve this goal. And this is what our mission is. And this is usually a few sentences long. Again, not necessary, but can be helpful. And now I'll show you one example. Zingerman's Businesses is a really great model to look to as well if you're just starting in business or just want some new input. It's a group of, I think, around 15 to 20 businesses in Ann Arbor, and their founder has done a lot of writing. But they have a really neat visioning process, which they do have some free tools online to use. They actually have people envision something and write about it as though it's the present. So you'd say, if we're going to do a 10-year vision, you get together and you actually sit and try to free flow with your ideas and write out, and you write in the present, like it's 10 years from now, right? It's 2031. And we have done this today. This is what our business looks like. And so you're actually trying to put yourself in the brain space of the present, which can be a really fun, kind of different way to think about what that vision is going to look like, and a fun way to have kind of a story to tell to people you're working with, people you're hiring, and or even to share publicly. And then mission statements. Again, those of you in the nonprofit sector definitely are probably familiar with these. This is actually Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is one of the largest co-ops in the country. They have around 2,000 worker-owner members on the East Coast. And even though they're not a nonprofit, they decided to have a company mission. And basically, these are the goals that they put forth. So you can see it's pretty short, really concise, and that's the goals that they've put forth as a cooperative that they're going to work towards. And then I'm just going to quickly go through some high-level ideas of other policies and procedures that you might want to implement, especially if you're just starting out as a cooperative. So personnel policies, employee handbooks, you probably already have these in any sort of company you're working with. They're not unique to co-ops. But I always just like to point out it is important, even in a co-op, often to have these so that you know how you're all operating with each other as employees, not only as shared co-owners. And I think I mentioned this last week. The idea of a member handbook can also be a really great idea for a co-op, which is basically like an employee handbook, but it's for, even if you're the same people, you have your, like, we're sharing these ideals and things we're going to work towards as employees, but we're also as co-owners going to commit to these types of workings together. Those can be really helpful to have actually written down somewhere. Intake processes for co-ops, as we've talked about before, bringing somebody on board a co-op is pretty different than bringing them on to a regular business, because they would be likely what we call a candidate member, where they're coming on board for the time they're a candidate. They are like any other employee. They don't have ownership of the business, but at some point they are going to possibly have a chance to buy into the business. You might, as the owners, vote them in to be a co-owner. So things like having them sit in on a certain number of meetings, like we talked about at the beginning, can be really helpful. Having an evaluation process that follows them through that beginning few months with the company, things like that. So it's really nice to have a very clear process so that everybody comes through, just like hiring any employee. You want to have a clear hiring onboarding process. But for co-ops, it often has to add in that layer of learning how to become an owner to get that person up to speed to join the team, or see if they want to, and see from your perspective whether you like working with them, not only as a coworker, but also as a co-owner. Just generally kind of requirements and shared expectations. These would be things like meeting expectations, like we talked about earlier. This would vary a lot within your business. So whatever you think might be helpful to document can be really helpful to do that, whether you put it into handbooks or have just, different types of documents that you would have in your office, things like that. One thing we had at the bakery was a conflict resolution profile that was part of what we filled out, so that we had a little binder of those things. And what we agreed upon was that you would fill out this conflict resolution profile for yourself, so that you could say different ways that you'd like to be approached in times of conflict. And if you had a conflict with someone else, you would go to refer back to that, to check in with that other person, so that you understood some of the things that they would be really appreciative of if you were going to approach them about something. So these can manifest in lots of ways. Again, kind of just the co-op idea of take the time to think about those things, because you're going to be doing a lot together through times of good excitement and challenging times. Obviously, compensation benefits plan, that would apply to any kind of company, a scheduling system, accountability and grievance procedures. What are people going to do, either as employees or co-owners, if they feel like things are not being held accountable? These shared expectations, what does that look like? And how might it be different for an employee who's not yet an owner versus those of you who are co-owners? How will you hold each other accountable or talk to each other about grievances you might have? And then kind of larger, like communication. I talked a little bit about conflict resolution, plans, profiles, things like that. I would definitely take some time to look at what you might want to talk about as a group, especially if you're just starting out. This is one thing I have in the resources. Just as I was just talking about, oftentimes in co-ops, there are a lot of challenges. You're doing a lot together. This is a great little book that I have a link to that just has a ton of great resources and stories. So as much as you want to plan for everything to work well, I also just always recommend, take some time to think about when this process doesn't work, then what are you going to do? Like what can we put in place ahead of time to try to help us through and make sure that we have some processes in place to work with each other. So really quickly, some resources. Again, these will be emailed to you. One relatively new resource, if you're starting a co-op, that I'm really excited to share is this first one, How to Start a Worker Cooperative. It's currently a $50 fee that gets you access to an incredible course that the LA Co-op Lab has put together recently. A really good overview of how to start this specific kind of business. Zingerman's The Visioning I mentioned. There's some tools there that you can look at if you want to look at writing a vision. The Democracy at Work Institute I've mentioned before, lots of co-op resources. Another manual that's actually free, that's pretty comprehensive too, is called Think Outside the Boss, which is from the Sustainable Economies Law Center in the Bay. And then there's the link to that book for dealing with issues that might come up. There's also quite a bit written about that sort of stuff too with co-ops. So that is all I have for today. I'll stop for a few minutes of questions, but thanks everyone for listening.
So we had a couple of comments, no questions sitting there, but a couple of comments. So Linda, unfortunately, had to leave to prep for another meeting, but thanks for all the great info. Anna's saying that the LA Co-op is very useful, so the SELC. And Susan is familiar with the Sustainable Economic Law Center as well. Also says they're great. So
yeah, they have a full co-op law library in addition to resources. Hopefully you've all seen that. It's an incredible resource that we have here in California.
So I have a question as well. You mentioned on the intake process about how, and this is the first time I've heard you use the expression about maybe how candidates might be invited to buy in to the organization. Mm-hmm. How common is could you elaborate on that a little bit? How that would work.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and we didn't really focus in on that, the specifics of really kind of the buy-in, but that's a very typical, pretty necessary piece for a co-op, is that the person who might become an owner at that point, if they get voted in, would buy in some form, and a co-op can set that amount for their co-op however they want. But it's sort of, it has an aspect of it that's about committing, right? That putting some kind of money down does show a commitment to becoming an owner and contributing to that business. It also has the tax implication as well, because you will start getting taxed as an owner once you start getting profits. So it's important to show on the books that there's something to say, I'm actually, financially an owner of this business. So it has two aspects, but the beauty of the co-op sector is that those tend to be relatively small, because we don't ever want it to be a barrier, right? If somebody doesn't have that amount, and very, very infrequently is that an amount of money that's huge in co-ops. It's not people are bringing enough money to finance the whole company. Often in co-ops, it's a way to have a small pool of member buy-ins, anywhere from $250 to say $5,000 is, in my mind, the most kind of the biggest spread I've seen. Co-ops are often between those. Sometimes they do get higher if people want, totally dependent on the co-op, but that is a piece. Typically you're a candidate. Then at the time of the vote, you buy in, you do whatever other membership steps the co-op has decided on, and at that point you get considered a co-owner.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, there's nothing else sitting in the Q&A or the chat. So I think I'm gonna thank you everybody for coming. Point out again that we're one of the two. We are both a women's business centre. And if you're not in our neighborhood, there's one of those pretty much everywhere in California. I think pretty much everywhere in the country. We're also an SBDC, and once again, there's those exist pretty much everywhere, and these are the other parts of our region. So thank you very much for your engagement, for your questions and responses in the chat, and your response on the poll. Thank you, Ashley, for some really useful information. And if you haven't yet connected with us, please remember you can do so. I will quickly throw those into the chat, but I'm sure I recognize you all. You folks are all from prior ones, so you've all seen these. If you're not yet a client of the West Centre, all sorts of ways you can do it, and you'll also be able to shortly be able to see the recording of this in our recorded webinar archive. So thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend, everybody.